October 15th, 1987. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti walked into Benedetti's funeral home on Mulberry Street carrying what he believed was papal consolation. The envelope bore the Vatican seal. Inside was a death warrant signed 44 years ago, for his own father. Every Don in the room recognized the papal stationery. They'd all received similar envelopes over the decades. Benedetti's sons stopped their grieving. Geneviese's soldiers reached for their guns. The Lucchese underboss crossed himself twice and backed toward the door, because they all knew what Vatican envelopes meant in their world. Orders, contracts, names of men who'd confessed too much in the wrong booth. But this envelope was different. This one contained proof that the Catholic Church had been running the five families like puppets since 1943, and Cardinal Torretti, their most trusted priest, had just become their most dangerous enemy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched like a funeral shroud. Alessandro's fingers trembled against the Vatican seal as 30 pairs of eyes tracked his every breath. The mahogany casket of Don Salvatore Benedetti seemed to pulse in his peripheral vision, but all he could focus on was the photograph paper-clip to the execution order in his hands. His father, younger than Alessandro had ever seen him, wearing a resistance armband, standing beside 3 other men whose faces had been crossed out in red ink. The date stamp read March 15, 1943, authorized by Cardinal Secretary of State. Liquidate asset. You gonna read that out loud, Father? The voice belonged to Vincent Benedetti, the dead Don's eldest son. His hand rested inside his jacket. Or should we guess? Alessandro's throat felt like sandpaper. In 30 years of walking among wolves, he'd never felt the predator's breath this close. These men had confessed their sins to him in darkened booths, trusted him with family secrets, territorial disputes, murder contracts. He'd absolved them believing he was saving their souls. Now he understood. He'd been harvesting their secrets for the Vatican's political machinery. "There's been a mistake," Alessandro whispered, though the words tasted like ash. His eyes found the letterhead again, property of Vatican Intelligence Archives. Classification, papal eyes only. Intelligence Archives. Not pastoral care. Not spiritual guidance. Intelligence. Funny thing about mistakes, Cardinal. Tommy Lucchese stepped forward, his Oxford shoes silent on the funeral home's Persian rug. They got a way of becoming permanent real quick in our line of work. Alessandro's mind raced through decades of conversations. How many confessional secrets had he dutifully reported in his monthly briefings to Cardinal Secretary Bertoli? How many pastoral guidance requests had he delivered from Rome to crime families across New York? He'd thought he was building bridges between the sacred and the profane. He'd been running messages between puppet masters and their marionettes. "My father died fighting Mussolini," Alessandro said, his voice gaining strength. "He died fighting fascists. Your father died because he outlived his usefulness to Rome." This from Angelo Genovese, whose confession 3 weeks ago had revealed plans to move heroin through Brooklyn's port, information Alessandro had faithfully passed along in his report, just like you're about to. The funeral home's ornate chandelier cast dancing shadows across the walls as men shifted positions. Alessandro recognized the choreography, wolves circling wounded prey. But something else moved behind their eyes, not just threat, fear. Because if the Vatican had been manipulating them for 4 decades, what other secrets lay buried in Rome's archives? What other families had been sacrificed on the altar of papal politics? "You all received envelopes over the years," Alessandro said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Orders disguised as blessings, target lists disguised as pastoral concerns. Vincent Benedetti's face had gone corpse pale. The Colombo hits in 75. Rome sent word they were planning to betray other families to the feds. The Bonanno territories. Tommy Lucchese's voice cracked. "We got Vatican intelligence about their expansion plans." "All of it," Alessandro breathed. "Every territorial war, every internal conflict, every strategic elimination. Rome orchestrated all of it." The room erupted in a symphony of sliding metal as guns cleared leather. But the barrels weren't all pointed at Alessandro. Decades of suspicion, betrayal, and Vatican manipulation had finally found their focus. The five families were seeing their puppet strings for the first time. Nobody moves. Vincent's voice cut through the chaos. We got bigger problems than killing one priest. Alessandro felt the envelope's weight differently now. Not papal blessing, not spiritual guidance. Evidence. 44 years of documentation proving the Catholic Church had been playing gangster families against each other like pieces on a chessboard, and he was the last link in their chain of deception. They killed your father because he discovered what you just discovered, Angelo said quietly. Question is, you gonna die for the same truth, or you gonna help us burn Rome's operation to the ground? Through the funeral home's stained glass windows, Alessandro could see black sedans pulling up to the curb. Vatican license plates. His handlers had arrived to clean up their mess. His mother's face flashed in his memory. 83 years old, rosary beads worn smooth by decades of prayer, still believing her husband had died a hero's death in God's service, still believing her son carried on sacred work among New York's lost souls. The truth would kill her faster than the cancer already eating her bones. But the lie had already killed his father, and now it was coming for him. Alessandro looked at the guns, the desperate faces, the evidence of Vatican treachery in his hands. 30 years of faith crumbling into dust and deception. The sedan's doors were opening outside. Choose fast, Cardinal, Vincent hissed, because those aren't altar boys coming through that door. If you're gripped by Cardinal Toretti's impossible choice and want to discover whether he'll sacrifice everything for truth or protect the faith that destroyed his family, make sure you're following this story. Tomorrow's chapter reveals the Vatican's deadliest secret and why they've been willing to kill to protect it for nearly half a century. The sedan's engines ticked like metal hearts cooling in the October air. Alessandro pressed his back against the funeral home's mahogany-paneled wall, the Vatican envelope crumpled against his chest like a paper dagger. Through the stained glass, he watched 4 men in dark suits emerge from the vehicles, Vatican security, though they moved with the predatory grace of former military. Monsignor Burke's cleanup crew. 30 years, Alessandro thought, his breath coming in shallow pulls. 30 years of believing I was saving souls. The weight of those decades pressed down on him now like a cathedral's stone vault. He remembered his ordination day in 1957, standing before Cardinal Bertoli's predecessor with trembling hands and an unshakable faith that God had called him to minister among New York's lost sheep. The Archbishop had spoken of special pastoral work, of reaching souls others couldn't touch, of bringing divine light into society's darkest corners. You have your father's courage, the Cardinal had said, placing weathered hands on Alessandro's shoulders. He died serving the Church's mission. Now you'll continue that sacred work. Sacred work. Alessandro almost laughed at the bitter irony, but the sound caught in his throat like broken glass. Vincent Benedetti moved closer, his Colt, 45 steady and practiced hands. My old man confessed to you about the Anastasia contract 3 months before Albert got hit in that barber shop. Told you he was worried about territorial blowback. Vincent's eyes were black as confession booth shadows. 2 weeks later, Rome sends word through you that Albert was planning to eliminate our Brooklyn operations. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say, Father? The memories cascaded like dominoes toppling. Alessandro saw himself at 28, earnest and faithful, delivering what he'd believed were pastoral guidance letters from Rome to crime families across the 5 boroughs. Letters that always seemed to arrive just before territorial wars erupted. Messages that provided uncanny intelligence about rival family movements. He'd thought he was preventing bloodshed through diplomatic intervention. He'd been lighting fuses. The confessional booth at St. Anthony's, Alessandro whispered, his voice hollow as an empty tomb. You all came to me there. For 30 fucking years, Tommy Lucchese spat. Told you things we never told our own blood. Family secrets, business plans, fear about rival moves. His laugh was sharp as a switchblade. Thought we were talking to God through you. Turns out we were briefing Rome's intelligence operation. Through the wall, Alessandro could hear his handler's footsteps on the funeral home's front steps. Heavy, measured, final. His mind flashed to his mother in her hospital bed at Mount Sinai, rosary beads clicking through her paper-thin fingers as she prayed for her son's safety. She'd whispered to him yesterday about how proud she remained of her husband's sacrifice, how blessed she felt that their son continued serving God's work among the suffering. The cancer was eating her from the inside, but learning the truth would devour what remained faster than any disease. "There's another exit," Angelo Genovese said quietly, nodding toward the funeral home's rear corridor. "Service entrance leads to the alley. But you step through that door with us, Cardinal, and there's no going back to your comfortable lie." Alessandro's fingers traced the papal seal on the envelope. Wax and ribbon that had represented divine authority for his entire adult life now felt like chains. The document inside detailed not just his father's execution, but years of Vatican manipulation, crime families used as instruments of papal foreign policy, territorial wars orchestrated to maintain profitable instability, confessional secrets weaponized to control criminal enterprises across 3 decades. His father hadn't just stumbled across this conspiracy. According to the file, he'd been recruited by Vatican intelligence in 1942 to infiltrate resistance operations, then eliminated when he'd threatened to expose the Church's collaboration with both Allied and Axis forces, playing all sides, betting on all horses, just like they'd trained Alessandro to do without him ever knowing. The front door's lock clicked. His handlers were inside. "Your move, Cardinal," Vincent whispered. "Die here defending Rome's lies, or live long enough to burn their whole fucking operation down." Alessandro closed his eyes and saw his mother's face, peaceful in her hospital bed, sustained by faith that had become her final comfort. Then he saw his father's young face in the photograph, wearing a resistance armband, believing he was fighting for justice. Both of them betrayed by the institution Alessandro had served his entire life. Both of them destroyed by the same machine that now came for him. The envelope crinkled as his grip tightened. Evidence, proof, truth that would shatter everything he'd believed, everything he'd built, everyone he loved. But lies had already shattered his family once. Heavy footsteps approached the viewing room's double doors. Alessandro looked toward the rear corridor, toward the choice that would either damn him or finally set his father's ghost free. The service entrance beckoned like a confession booth in reverse, a place where sins weren't absolved, but finally exposed to killing light. The doors behind them began to open. Alessandro lunged toward the service corridor as the viewing room's double doors exploded inward. Vincent Benedetti's, 45, barked twice, the muzzle flashes strobing against funeral home wallpaper as Vatican security flooded through the entrance. Alessandro's cassock whipped around his legs as he stumbled down the narrow hallway, the crumpled envelope pressed against his ribs like a sacred relic turned weapon. Behind him, chaos erupted in overlapping shouts and gunfire, but Alessandro's world had contracted to the rhythm of his own panicked breathing and the weight of 44 years pressing down on his shoulders like Christ's cross. The service door burst open under his desperate hands, spilling him into the alley's October chill. Garbage cans and delivery trucks created a maze of shadows, but Alessandro barely registered his surroundings. His mind was drowning in a flood of returning memories, fragments he'd buried so deep they'd become archaeological layers of his own denial. The phone call. Christ, how had he forgotten the phone call? Alessandro pressed his back against the funeral home's brick wall, his breath coming in ragged clouds. It had been 3 days ago. 3 days before Don Benedetti's funeral, before the envelope, before his entire world cracked open like an egg. He'd been in his study at the cathedral rectory, reviewing his notes for Sunday's sermon, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end had been papery with age, speaking in the Sicilian dialect of his childhood, words he hadn't heard since his grandmother's death 20 years earlier. "Santo Alessandro," the voice had whispered. "Little Saint Alessandro, do you still remember your Nonna's lullabies?" The blood had drained from Alessandro's face. Only one person had ever called him by that pet name. Only one person had sung him those particular Sicilian lullabies in the cramped tenement apartment where he'd spent his earliest years. "Papa?" The word had escaped his lips like a prayer. Not your father, boy, but someone who knew him. Someone who was there the night Rome's wolves came calling. The voice carried the weight of decades and the rasp of approaching death. They told you he died fighting Mussolini's fascists, didn't they? Told you he was a hero of the resistance? Alessandro had gripped the phone receiver until his knuckles went white. Who is this? Salvatore Benedetti. Don Benedetti to the families. But to your father, I was just Salvi, the kid from Palermo who ran messages between partisan cells. The old man's laugh had been bitter as funeral wine. Your father saved my life twice in the war, Santu. Once from a German patrol. Once from Vatican assassins sent to silence him permanently. The study's walls had seemed to contract around Alessandro like a confession booth. That's impossible. My father died serving the church's mission. Your father died because he discovered the church was serving its own mission, not God's. Don Benedetti's voice had grown urgent, fading at the edges. They recruited him to infiltrate the resistance, then killed him when he threatened to expose their triple agent operations. Same way they recruited you, boy. Same way they've been using you for 30 years. Alessandro had wanted to hang up, should have hung up. But something in the old Don's voice, a thread of desperate truth, had kept him frozen. I'm dying, Santu. Cancer in my bones, my blood, my brain. But before I meet whatever judgment waits for men like me, I need to set one ghost free. Benedetti had coughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Come to my funeral. Bring whatever envelope Rome gives you. Trust me, they'll give you an envelope. And when you open it, you'll finally understand what your father died trying to tell the world. The line had gone dead. Alessandro had sat in his study for hours afterward, staring at the phone, trying to convince himself it had been a hallucination, a dying man's ravings, a cruel hoax designed to shake his faith. But now, pressed against the funeral home's alley wall with Vatican bullets chewing through the service door's wood frame, Alessandro understood. Don Benedetti hadn't been raving. He'd been keeping a 44-year promise to a dead friend. The old Don had orchestrated this entire revelation from beyond the grave, ensuring Alessandro would be at his funeral, ensuring the Vatican would provide him with classified documents they'd never intended him to see, ensuring the truth would finally surface even if it destroyed them all. Salvatore Benedetti, the man whose confession booth revelations Alessandro had been reporting to Rome for 3 decades. The man whose family secrets had shaped Vatican intelligence operations across 2 generations. The man who'd apparently been playing his own long game against the institution that had murdered his wartime friend. Alessandro fumbled for the envelope with shaking hands. The wax seal bore not just papal authority but a deeper mark, the sign of a man who'd spent 44 years planning the perfect revenge against Rome's machine of manipulation. Don Benedetti had turned Alessandro into a weapon aimed at the Vatican's heart, and the trigger had finally been pulled. The alley felt like a tomb carved from brick and shadow. Alessandro's cassock clung to his sweat-soaked skin as he pressed deeper into the maze of dumpsters and fire escapes, the envelope burning against his chest like a brand. Behind him, the gunfire had stopped, replaced by something far more terrifying. Silence. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the payphone bolted to the tenement wall at the alley's mouth. 3 numbers. That was all. 3 numbers that had been his lifeline to Vatican security for 30 years whenever pastoral work among the families grew dangerous. The rotary dial clicked with agonizing slowness. 7, 4, 2, Toretti. Monsignor Burke's voice came through crisp and efficient, betraying no surprise despite the hour. Where are you? The funeral. It went wrong. Alessandro's voice cracked like a choir boy's. Don Benedetti, he left documents. Evidence of... Stop talking. The command sliced through Alessandro's confession like a blade. Public line. Where are you exactly? The question felt loaded with more than logistical concern. Alessandro's survival instincts, honed by 3 decades ministering in Little Italy's shadow world, began screaming warnings. Burke's tone was wrong, too controlled, too prepared. I need sanctuary, Alessandro whispered. The families think I've been... Cardinal Toretti. Burke's voice dropped to liturgical formality. Where are you? Alessandro's finger hovered over the phone's cradle. In the background of Burke's end, he could hear muffled voices, radio static, the sound of men coordinating search patterns. the same sounds he'd heard from the Vatican sedans outside the funeral home. They weren't coming to rescue him. They were coming to collect him. The phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the brick wall as it swayed on its metal cord. Alessandro stumbled backward, his world tilting on its axis like a ship in a typhoon. The Vatican wasn't just covering up the evidence, they were eliminating it, and he was the last piece of evidence that could breathe, think, and testify. His mother's voice echoed in his memory from their conversation 3 days ago. "Your father would be so proud, Alessandro. Serving God among lost souls, bringing light to dark places. He always said the church's work required brave men willing to sacrifice everything for truth. Truth." The word tasted like ashes now. Alessandro forced his legs to move, stumbling deeper into the labyrinth of alleys that spiderwebbed between tenements. His breathing came in sharp gasps that formed ghost clouds in the October air. Every shadow could hide Vatican security. Every footstep might be his last. But it wasn't just fear driving his flight through Little Italy's back streets. It was a growing, terrible clarity. The pieces of 30 years were falling into place like dominoes in reverse, revealing a pattern he'd been too faithful to see. Why had Cardinal Bertoli always insisted on personal debriefings rather than written reports? Why had Alessandro's pastoral guidance letters to crime families contained such specific intelligence about rival operations? Why had every major territorial war in New York's underworld been preceded by Vatican communications that Alessandro himself had delivered? He ducked under a fire escape as car engines growled at the alley's mouth, black sedans prowling the streets like mechanical hounds. They knew these neighborhoods better than he'd realized, which meant they'd been operating here longer than they'd ever told him. His legs carried him toward familiar territory, the network of church basements, rectory gardens, and parish halls where he'd spent 3 decades building relationships with families the world had written off as irredeemable. Men who'd confessed their darkest secrets in his booth, trusting him to carry their sins to God. Instead, he'd been carrying their secrets to Rome. St. Anthony's loomed ahead, its Gothic spires piercing the night sky like stone prayers. Alessandro had heard confession there every Thursday for 15 years, the booth where Vincent Benedetti had whispered about the Anastasia contract, where Tommy Lucchese had revealed fears about FBI surveillance, where Angelo Genovese had confessed his plans to expand into Brooklyn's docks. All of it faithfully reported in Alessandro's monthly briefings. All of it transformed into intelligence that had shaped decades of territorial wars, strategic eliminations, and carefully orchestrated chaos. The church's side door was unlocked. Father Martinez never secured it before midnight. Alessandro slipped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast nave like gunshots. Rows of empty pews stretched before him like an army of wooden witnesses to 30 years of unwitting betrayal. He knelt before the altar, the envelope clutched in his shaking hands. The papal seal caught the flickering light of votive candles, throwing shadows that danced like devils across the marble crucifix. His father's ghost seemed to hover in the sanctuary's silence, waiting for justice that had been delayed 44 years. Outside, engines were drawing closer. Alessandro broke the seal. The wax crumbled like ancient bones between Alessandro's fingers, releasing secrets that had festered in Vatican vaults for 44 years. The parchment inside felt heavy as lead, dense with the weight of institutional betrayal. As his eyes moved across the document's opening lines, the church's marble floor seemed to tilt beneath his knees. Classified Memorandum, Vatican Secretariat of State, Subject, Elimination of Asset Pietro 7, Pietro Torretti, Authorization, Cardinal Secretary Maglione, Date, November 15, 1943. Asset Pietro 7 has become compromised and poses immediate threat to Vatican intelligence operations in German-occupied Italy. Subject threatens to expose church collaboration with both Allied and Axis intelligence services. Recommend immediate termination under cover of resistance action. Alessandro's vision blurred. The Latin phrases that followed danced like demons across the page. Clinical descriptions of his father's execution, detailed justifications for murder couched in the language of papal bureaucracy. But it was the attached surveillance photographs that shattered what remained of his faith. his father, young and vital at 28, standing in a Roman piazza beside Cardinal Maglione himself, both men smiling, both conspirators in the same web that had now ensnared Alessandro for 3 decades. The photographs documented a meeting from October 1943, 1 month before Pietro Toretti's death. His father wasn't just a victim of Vatican betrayal, he'd been a willing participant, just like Alessandro, right up until the moment he'd tried to break free. A handwritten note in the file's margin, penned in Cardinal Maglione's spidery script, made Alessandro's blood freeze. Pietro's conscience has become a liability. His threats to expose our trilateral operations to Allied command cannot be tolerated. His elimination will serve dual purpose, silencing dangerous witness while providing tragic motivation for future recruitment of his son. The boy Alessandro shows promising devotion. Orphaned grief will deepen his commitment to church service. They had murdered his father specifically to ensure Alessandro's loyalty. The nave's vast silence pressed against his eardrums like the weight of an ocean. Outside, car doors slammed with military precision. Through stained glass windows that depicted saints and martyrs, Alessandro could see flashlight beams sweeping the church grounds like searchlights hunting escaped prisoners. He forced himself to read deeper into the file. Page after page of documentation spanning decades, his own recruitment, careful psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual guidance, the systematic exploitation of confessional intelligence he'd gathered from crime families. But the scope expanded far beyond New York's 5 families. Operation Shepherd's staff had tentacles reaching across continents. Vatican operatives embedded in organized crime syndicates from Sicily to Chicago to Marseille. Confessional secrets transformed into geopolitical leverage. The Church playing all sides in conflicts from World War II through the Cold War, accumulating power and wealth while millions died in carefully orchestrated chaos. Alessandro found his own codename in the records asset Alessandro 21. His handler's assessments read like psychological autopsy reports of a man too faithful to recognize his own manipulation. Subject demonstrates exceptional compartmentalization abilities. Believes himself to be conducting pastoral outreach while functioning as primary intelligence asset. Recommend continued isolation from broader operational scope. His genuine faith makes him invaluable for long-term penetration of criminal organizations. The church's front doors groaned open. Heavy footsteps echoed in the narthex, multiple pairs, moving with practiced coordination. Alessandro recognized the sound from 30 years of Vatican security escorts. Men who'd protected him during dangerous neighborhood missions, who'd shared communion wine at private masses, who'd become the closest thing to family his celibate life allowed. Now they were hunting him like an animal. His fingers traced a photograph paperclipped to the file's final page. His mother as a young woman, standing outside Mount Sinai Hospital in 1944, cradling infant Alessandro in her arms. Even in the surveillance photos, grainy black and white, her grief was palpable. She'd been mourning her husband's death, believing his sacrifice had meaning, never knowing she was being watched by the men who'd ordered his execution, the same men now orchestrating her son's elimination. A notation beneath the photograph chilled Alessandro's soul. Subject Maria Auck shows continued value as emotional leverage over asset Alessandro 21. Her terminal illness provides optimal timeline for final operational phase. Recommend asset termination following subject's natural death to eliminate witness liability. They'd been planning his murder for months, waiting for his mother to die so his elimination wouldn't shatter the faith that sustained her final days. Footsteps drew closer to the nave. Alessandro could hear whispered commands, the metallic click of weapons being readied. His hands moved with desperate precision, tearing key pages from the file and stuffing them inside his cassock. The rest he left scattered across the altar like blasphemous communion wafers. The confessional booth loomed in the sanctuary's shadows, that wooden chamber where he'd heard 3 decades of secrets, never understanding he was violating the most sacred trust in Catholic faith. Every confession he'd reported to Rome had been a betrayal disguised as salvation. Alessandro crawled toward the booth as flashlight beams swept through stained glass windows, transforming biblical scenes into fractured kaleidoscopes of colored light. The confessional's door opened like a mouth hungry for one final secret. But this time, Alessandro would be the penitent instead of the priest, and his confession would destroy everything. Inside the confessional booth, Alessandro pressed his back against the familiar wooden partition, struggling to control his ragged breathing. The small chamber that had been his sanctuary for 3 decades now felt like a coffin. Through the screen's intricate latticework, he could see flashlight beams sweeping the nave like the eyes of hunting predators. His trembling fingers found the torn pages hidden in his cassock. In the absolute darkness, he couldn't read the words, but he didn't need to. Every line was burned into his memory now, including the one detail that had shattered his understanding of everything: Cardinal Secretary Maglione. The name had triggered a cascade of suppressed memories. Alessandro's childhood had been punctuated by visits from a kindly old priest who'd taken special interest in his education, his spiritual development, his eventual path to seminary. Father Maglione, who'd later become Cardinal Maglione, had been his mentor, his patron, his spiritual father, the same man who'd ordered his biological father's execution. But it was the date on the assassination order that revealed the most devastating truth. November 15, 1943. Alessandro had been born on November 16, 1943. His father had been murdered while his mother was in labor, bringing his son into the world even as Vatican assassins were planning Pietro Toretti's exit from it. Cardinal Maglione hadn't discovered Alessandro after his father's death. He'd been positioned to recruit the boy before Pietro was even eliminated. The kindly mentor who'd guided Alessandro's entire spiritual journey had been his father's killer, grooming the victim's son from birth to serve the same machine that had destroyed his family. Every bedtime prayer Maglione had taught him, every seminary recommendation, every encouraging letter during Alessandro's darkest moments of doubt, all of it had been manipulation by his father's murderer, shaping him into the perfect weapon against the criminal families his father had died trying to protect. The booth's wooden panels creaked as footsteps approached the confessional area. Alessandro could hear Monsignor Burke's voice directing the search. "Check every corner. He's here somewhere. And when you find him, remember, this is a matter of church security. No witnesses." Through the screen, Alessandro watched black-clad figures methodically examining each pew, each side altar, each shadow where a desperate priest might hide. These weren't just Vatican security operatives. In their practiced movements, their coordinated hand signals, their cold efficiency, he recognized something that made his blood freeze. They moved like soldiers, like the same men who'd hunted partisans through Italian villages during the war, like the assassination teams his father had tried to expose before they silenced him permanently. The Vatican hadn't just covered up Pietro Toretti's murder. They'd preserved the entire infrastructure that had killed him, allowing it to operate for 4 additional decades under the blessing of papal authority. Operation Shepherd's Staff wasn't an intelligence operation. It was an execution machine disguised as pastoral care. Alessandro's hands found his rosary, but the familiar prayers stuck in his throat like glass. How many Hail Marys had he recited while reporting confessional secrets to Rome? How many Our Fathers had he whispered while helping orchestrate territorial wars that left families destroyed? His entire spiritual life had been a blasphemy wrapped in ritual. A shadow fell across the confessional screen. Alessandro held his breath as Monsignor Burke's silhouette paused outside the booth, his head tilted as if listening for the sound of prayer or desperation. Burke's hand rested on the door latch. 30 years of faithful service, Burke murmured, his voice barely audible through the partition. Did you really think we hadn't prepared for this possibility? Did you imagine we'd simply trust you forever without contingency plans? The latch clicked open. Pale light spilled into the booth's darkness, illuminating Alessandro's tear-streaked face. Burke stood in the doorway, no longer the supportive colleague who'd guided Alessandro through 3 decades of missions. His expression carried the cold satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered dangerous prey. "Cardinal Toretti," Burke said with mock formality. "Or should I say, Asset Alessandro 21? Alessandro stared into the face of his supposed friend and saw his father's ghost reflected there. Another idealistic man who'd discovered too late that the institution he'd served was rotten from its foundation. But Pietro Torretti had found his courage in time to try resistance, even if it had cost him everything. Now it was Alessandro's turn to choose between comfortable complicity and devastating truth. "You're right," Alessandro whispered, rising slowly from the kneeling bench. "You did prepare for this possibility." Burke's confidence flickered. Something in Alessandro's tone had shifted, carrying a resolve that 30 years of manipulation hadn't quite crushed. "But you made one mistake," Alessandro continued, meeting Burke's gaze directly. "You assumed I'd die as quietly as my father did." The stolen pages crinkled against his chest like armor made of truth. Burke's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, but Alessandro was already stepping forward, closing the distance between them. The confessional booth that had contained so many secrets now expelled its final, most dangerous truth into the sanctuary's dim light. "Alessandro, you're making a grave mistake," Burke said, his voice carrying the same paternal tone that had guided Alessandro through decades of unwitting betrayal. "Whatever you think you've learned from those documents, you're seeing only fragments. The complete picture is that you turn my father's murder into my recruitment strategy." Alessandro's words cut through Burke's practiced manipulation like a blade through silk. "Cardinal Maglione didn't find me after Pietro died. He positioned himself to collect me before the assassination order was even signed." Burke's mask slipped completely. The kindly Monsignor vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating that belonged in boardrooms where wars were planned rather than sanctuaries where souls were saved. "Your father was weak. He developed a conscience at precisely the wrong moment in history. The Church required stronger tools." Stronger tools. Alessandro tasted the words like poison. "Is that what you called the families I've been manipulating for 30 years? Tools for Vatican foreign policy?" The black-clad operatives had moved closer, forming a loose circle around the confessional area. Alessandro could see their faces now, not Italian features, but the hard angles of men who'd learned their craft in places where Geneva conventions were suggestions rather than laws. These weren't priests playing at espionage. They were killers wearing crosses. "The Benedetti funeral is tomorrow," Burke continued, his voice carrying the patience of a teacher correcting a slow student. "Don Salvatore's death creates a power vacuum that 5 families will fight to fill. Your presence there, carrying papal blessing for the grieving family, will provide perfect cover for eliminating 3 rival capos in a single operation, just as we've planned for 6 months." Alessandro's world tilted again. The funeral invitation. It wasn't coincidence. "Nothing has been coincidence, Alessandro. Don Salvatore's cancer was natural, but his decision to request last rites from you specifically was carefully orchestrated. The family's agreement to attend the funeral despite their territorial disputes required delicate diplomatic pressure, the kind only you could provide through your confessional relationships." The scope of the manipulation crashed over Alessandro like a tsunami. Every pastoral visit, every spiritual counseling session, every moment of genuine human connection he'd shared with grieving widows and guilt-ridden soldiers had been choreographed to serve Vatican intelligence operations. Even his compassion had been weaponized. "The envelope I was supposed to deliver," Alessandro said, understanding flooding through him like cold water, "it never contained papal blessing." Burke smiled with the satisfaction of a chess master revealing checkmate. Photographs of FBI surveillance positions around the funeral home, radio frequencies for federal tactical teams, escape routes mapped by our people inside the NYPD. Everything the families need to eliminate their federal watchers permanently. You're orchestrating a war between organized crime and federal law enforcement. We're eliminating obstacles to larger strategic objectives. The families have outlived their usefulness as intelligence assets. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force has accumulated too much information about our operations. Tomorrow's funeral will solve both problems simultaneously. Alessandro could see it all now. The families arriving at Don Salvatore's funeral, confident in their temporary truce, carrying the weapons and personnel necessary for a major territorial summit. The FBI surveillance teams positioned around the funeral home, believing they were documenting a routine mob gathering, and Alessandro himself, walking into the center of it carrying intelligence that would turn Little Italy into a battlefield. How many will die? Estimates suggest 40 to 60 immediate casualties, perhaps twice that number in the resulting investigations and retaliation cycles. Burke's clinical tone made mass murder sound like weather forecasting, acceptable losses for neutralizing security threats to church operations. Alessandro's hand moved to the stolen pages hidden against his chest. 40 years of Vatican intelligence operations documented in meticulous detail. Networks spanning continents. Assassination orders disguised as pastoral letters. Financial records showing Vatican banks laundering money for dictatorships and cartels across 3 decades. My mother, Alessandro whispered, the final piece clicking into place. She's not just dying naturally. Burke's silence confirmed what the documents had already revealed. Maria Toretti's sudden deterioration, the aggressive cancer that had appeared without warning, the experimental treatments that seemed to accelerate rather than slow her decline. The same physicians who treated her have been Vatican contractors since 1958, Burke said quietly. Her death will appear completely natural, and your grief will make tomorrow's operation even more convincing. A mourning priest carrying papal blessing to another grieving family. No federal surveillance team would suspect the true purpose of your visit. Alessandro understood with crystal clarity that this was the moment his father had faced 44 years ago. The instant when comfortable complicity became impossible, when the machinery of institutional evil revealed itself so completely that only 2 choices remained: willing collaboration or desperate resistance. There's still time to reconsider, Alessandro, Burke said. Your mother's condition could stabilize. Your position within the church could remain secure. All you need to do is deliver that envelope tomorrow as planned. The stolen pages crinkled against Alessandro's chest as his breathing steadied. His father's ghost was waiting for an answer that had been delayed nearly half a century. Alessandro felt the weight of 44 years pressing down on him like cathedral stones. His father's ghost stood in the sanctuary shadows, waiting for the choice that would either vindicate or damn them both. The stolen pages against his chest seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, the rhythm of truth demanding its voice. You want my answer? Alessandro said, his voice carrying a strength that surprised even him. Here it is. His hand moved not toward submission, but toward the altar, where scattered documents lay like blasphemous offerings. In one fluid motion, he swept the remaining files from the marble surface, sending pages cascading through the sanctuary's candlelit air like snow made of secrets. Asset Alessandro, 21, is dead, he declared, his voice echoing off vaulted ceilings that had witnessed centuries of confessions. But Cardinal Alessandro Toretti just found his faith. Burke's composed mask shattered completely. The kindly Monsignor who'd guided Alessandro through 3 decades of manipulation revealed himself as something far more dangerous. A man who'd transformed holy orders into hunting licenses, who'd perverted the sacraments into weapons of war. You're condemning your mother to death, Burke hissed, dropping all pretense of paternal concern. And yourself? Did you think we hadn't prepared for this possibility? Alessandro's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter recognition of a man who'd finally understood the game he'd been playing. You prepared for Asset Alessandro 21 to have a crisis of faith. You didn't prepare for Cardinal Toretti to remember what faith actually means. The black-clad operatives closed their circle, weapons emerging from beneath clerical vestments like serpents from Eden's shadows. These weren't men who'd take confessions. They were men who'd create them through violence, then absolve themselves through institutional authority. 30 years, Alessandro continued, backing toward the altar rail. 30 years of thinking I was saving souls while you used me to orchestrate their destruction. But you made one crucial error in your calculations. Burke's eyes narrowed. What error? Alessandro's hand found the sanctuary lamp hanging beside the tabernacle, the eternal flame that marked the presence of consecrated hosts. With a sharp yank, he pulled it free from its chain, sending blessed oil splashing across the scattered documents. You forgot that some fires can't be controlled. The oil ignited instantly, transforming Vatican secrets into dancing flames that cast wild shadows across stone walls. 40 years of carefully documented sins began dissolving into ash and smoke, but Alessandro had already memorized what mattered most: The networks, the code names, the financial transfers, the assassination orders, everything he needed to destroy Operation Shepherd's staff was burning into his memory even as it burned away from existence. Burke lunged forward, trying to salvage what documents he could from the spreading flames. "You don't understand what you're destroying. These operations maintain global stability, without Vatican coordination, without Vatican manipulation," Alessandro corrected, his voice rising above the crackling fire. "Maybe the world can find its own way to peace." The operatives were moving now, their patience exhausted by the spreading destruction. But Alessandro wasn't finished. From inside his cassock, he withdrew the pages he'd hidden, the most damaging evidence, the documents that could unravel not just Operation Shepherd's staff, but expose the Vatican's shadow networks across 6 continents. "Tomorrow's funeral," he said, holding the pages above the flames like an offering to angry gods. "Those families you're planning to sacrifice? They're going to receive a different kind of papal blessing." Burke's face went ashen. "Alessandro, if you expose this publicly, the truth will destroy everything," Alessandro finished. "The church's political networks, the banking relationships, the intelligence operations, all of it will crumble when the world learns that Vatican City has been playing puppet master with organized crime for half a century." But Burke's expression shifted from panic to something approaching satisfaction. "And what about the millions of faithful Catholics who will lose their spiritual foundation? What about the children in Vatican schools, the hospitals run by church charity, the orphanages sustained by papal funding? You'll destroy their faith to satisfy your father's ghost?" Alessandro felt the weight of that question like a physical blow. Burke had found his weakness, not his loyalty to the church as institution, but his love for the church as sanctuary for innocent souls. How many believers would lose their spiritual foundation if these truths emerged? How many would suffer when the machinery of Catholic charity collapsed under the weight of institutional scandal? His mother's face swam before his vision. Maria Toretti, dying in her hospital bed, sustained in her final days by the same faith that had comforted her through 44 years of widowhood. Would exposing the truth give meaning to his father's sacrifice, or simply destroy the last thing keeping his mother's soul at peace? The flames reached toward the pages in his trembling hands. One choice would protect millions of innocent believers at the cost of enabling continued evil. The other would serve justice while potentially destroying the spiritual foundation of countless souls. Alessandro closed his eyes and heard his father's voice whispering across 4 decades. "Sometimes the greatest act of faith is losing faith itself." Alessandro opened his eyes and released the pages into the flames. The documents curled and blackened, Vatican secrets transforming into ash that danced upward like prayers finally finding their voice. Burke's anguished cry echoed through the sanctuary, but Alessandro felt only profound silence, the quiet that comes when a man stops running from truth and turns to face it completely. "You fool," Burke whispered, watching 40 years of carefully orchestrated power dissolving into smoke. "You've destroyed everything." "No," Alessandro said, his voice carrying the peace of a confession finally completed. "I've just remembered what everything actually means." The flames consumed the last of the evidence, but Alessandro had already made his choice about tomorrow's funeral. Not the choice Burke expected, nor the one his father's ghost demanded, but something else entirely. Something that honored both truth and mercy without sacrificing innocent souls on the altar of institutional justice. The operatives moved forward, but Alessandro raised his hand with the authority of a man who'd found his real calling 30 years too late. "Wait," he said, and something in his tone made them pause. "I have a different proposition." 6 months later, Little Italy. The morning mist clung to Mulberry Street like incense, softening the edges of a neighborhood that had seen too much truth for one lifetime. Alessandro walked slowly past the funeral home where Don Salvatore had been laid to rest, his civilian clothes feeling strange after 3 decades in clerical vestments. The families had received their papal blessing that day, though not the kind Burke had planned. Instead of intelligence that would trigger a war, Alessandro had delivered something far more dangerous to organized crime operations, a personal plea for peace that carried the weight of genuine pastoral care rather than manipulation. The FBI surveillance teams had observed a remarkable gathering. 5 crime families attending a funeral without a single act of violence, their leaders emerging with expressions of men who'd been reminded of their own mortality rather than their territorial ambitions. No shots fired, no federal intervention required, just the simple power of authentic spiritual guidance applied at exactly the right moment. Burke's network had unraveled more quietly than either of them had expected. Without the damning documents, Alessandro couldn't expose the full scope of Vatican intelligence operations to the press, but he could withdraw cooperation, refuse assignments, and quietly warn potential victims when possible. Operation Shepherd's staff had died not through explosive revelation, but through systematic non-compliance, death by 1,000 small betrayals rather than one dramatic exposure. Alessandro paused outside the small hospital where his mother had spent her final weeks. The experimental treatments had mysteriously improved after the night in the sanctuary, giving Maria Toretti 3 additional months of life, time enough for her son to sit beside her bed and speak honestly about faith, doubt, and the difference between serving God and serving the men who claimed to speak for him. She died holding his hand, her final words a whisper that still echoed in his dreams. "Your father would be proud. You found your way back to the light." The church had accepted Alessandro's resignation with surprising grace, perhaps recognizing that a man who'd burned Vatican secrets in a sanctuary might prove equally unpredictable if pushed toward more dramatic forms of rebellion. His pension was adequate, his silence was assumed, his conscience was finally, blessedly clear. Alessandro reached the corner where Hester Street met Mulberry, the same intersection where his father had walked 44 years earlier, carrying intelligence that would cost him everything. The morning sun broke through the mist, warming his face with the kind of natural blessing that required no institutional approval. He'd lost his faith in the church's political machine, but found something far more valuable in its place: faith in the simple human capacity for redemption, even after decades of collaboration with evil. The spiritual foundation that Burke had warned him about destroying hadn't crumbled when Alessandro chose truth over institutional loyalty. It had simply relocated, moving from marble cathedrals to the quiet spaces where people gathered to care for each other without ulterior motives. Alessandro pulled his coat closer against the morning chill and began walking toward the small community center where he'd been volunteering for the past month. No intelligence operations, no confessional secrets weaponized for geopolitical advantage, just the basic work of feeding people who were hungry and listening to those who needed someone to hear their stories without recording them for later use. His father's ghost walked beside him now, no longer demanding justice but offering companionship. The presence of a man who'd found peace in knowing his son had finally chosen light over comfortable darkness. The sun climbed higher over Little Italy, warming a neighborhood where 5 crime families had somehow found their way toward peace through the simple intervention of a priest who'd remembered, just in time, what priesthood actually meant. Some truths were worth more than their revelation. Some victories were measured not in institutional destruction, but in lives quietly saved from the machinery of organized evil. Alessandro smiled and walked on, carrying no secrets except the profound one that had taken him 30 years to learn. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is having faith itself, not in institutions, but in the possibility that tomorrow could be different from yesterday. The mist lifted completely, and the day began.